Alright, so this is a bit of a horror thriller, I guess you could call it, starring Helen Hunt. And she plays a psychiatrist and a wife in a family that's going through a bit of a rough patch. They're having some domestic troubles and things aren't exactly peachy. There's some tension between the family members, but that's not really the focus of the movie. But it does play into it. It adds to the overall mood and the overall tension of it. And this would be a very different movie that would play out very differently too if they weren't having those issues. So that's my first praise for the movie, but it's not my last, although early on in the movie I was far from impressed by this. Because one part of the main story here follows the dad, who's a cop, and he's part of the team investigating the disappearance of a young boy. That's sort of something going on in the background. Meanwhile, some strange things start happening around the house too. And I have to say that from the very beginning I had a few gripes with the movie. First of all, the opening sequence that deals with this kid disappearing. It felt very on the nose and it felt very much like they showed too much and it sort of deflated the suspense for me. Which kind of reduced my overall enthusiasm for the rest of the movie right off the bat. And then we just have this story that seems a little bit odd and doesn't really seem to be going anywhere. With kind of generic characters, to be honest, and dialogue that doesn't really feel all that mind-blowing. And I mean, the overall feel of the movie was just generic and fairly cheap too. Nothing about it felt very impressive from a technical perspective. But at the same time, I will have to say that I liked the pacing. The pacing was good, and the movie still did enough to keep me intrigued, because it doesn't really give that much away, actually. Which keeps your gears turning, trying to figure out what exactly is going on. It gives you enough to keep you interested, but not really much more than that. So that, combined with the tight pacing, did keep me engaged and entertained. But then the movie reaches the halfway point and everything more or less changes. Because it took a left turn I did not see coming, but I liked it. It was a bit of a gamble, I would say, but for me at least it very much paid off. And after that it all started to come together. You start getting some answers. And I started to appreciate the movie a lot more than I did during the first half. Because turns out that this one is way smarter than it initially lets on. And way more clever than I gave it credit for early on. And everything that felt a bit hokey and on the nose and too obvious in the first part ended actually paying off in the second part, and especially that opening sequence I mentioned, which had really bothered me up until that point, turned out to have been a very clever misdirect actually. So one of my least favorite things about the movie turned into something I could really appreciate. And as a result of all of that, I ended up really liking this and respecting it. Because it's fairly rare that a movie manages to fool me to this degree. And then to deliver a surprise that didn't feel cheap or forced or anything like that. So I definitely have to give kudos to the writer, because while the character writing isn't exactly brilliant, and neither is the dialogue, the underlying story and how it's constructed was pretty impressive. And I would say the same goes for the direction. As I said, on a purely technical level, this didn't stand out at all. But the way it was then put together and structured ended up being quite impressive. And perhaps that's more in the editing actually than the direction, depending on who was in charge of that, I guess. But that doesn't really matter, because the end result definitely managed to stand out as a whole. Now with that being said, this is a ridiculously easy movie to spoil. You can just ruin it in basically one sentence. So I would advise you to stay away from any trailers or anything else that could ruin it. Because once the surprise is spoiled, I would imagine the experience of watching this would be much less impressive. But anyway, I think that's enough babbling, so how about it? Would I recommend this? Yeah, I think it's a pretty fun little movie that's way more clever than it lets on. So maybe give it a look, or maybe don't. After all, I'm not your dad. But hey, what are your thoughts on this? Have you seen it? Did you like it? Let me know. And if you enjoyed the video, maybe give it a thumbs up or sub to the channel, because that would be fantastic. And if you'd like, you can also support me on Patreon or PayPal through the links in the description. And as always, I appreciate you and thanks for watching.